The colony of Jericho 7 burned under an alien sky. Syndicate warships hung like black monoliths above the surface, their massive cannons raining fire upon human settlements. What had once been a thriving frontier world was now a graveyard of shattered buildings and smoldering wreckage. Captain Elias Vero lay motionless beneath the twisted remains of a fallen transport, his breath shallow. Around him, Syndicate shock troops, hulking, armored creatures with insectoid features, moved methodically through the ruins, their glowing visors scanning for survivors. He gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the rusted combat knife in his hand. His rifle was gone, and even if he had it, he was outnumbered 10-1. A sharp, guttural voice broke the silence. "Find them." The order came from one of the Tarkans, the Syndicate's enforcers. Larger than the others, its armor gleamed under the fires of a burning habdome. Tarkans never wasted time. They killed quickly, efficiently. Vero steadied his breathing. He'd fought in the siege of Vega Prime, had stared death in the face more times than he cared to count. But this was different. There was no army here, no fleet coming to save them. Just scattered survivors hiding like rats while the Syndicate tightened the noose. The first human colony to fall without a fight. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. And then, something changed. The Syndicate patrol slowed. One of the aliens, an officer, by the markings on its chest, tilted its head, as if sensing something. The others shifted uneasily, their movements less assured. Their training told them that humans rarely traveled alone, but that wasn't what unnerved them. It was the silence. Then the officer staggered. A split second later, its head snapped to the side with a sickening crunch, a blade protruding from the base of its skull. It collapsed without a sound. The patrol reacted instantly, weapons raised, too late. The second soldier fell with a clean, surgical slice across the throat. Another dropped with a dull thud, its armor pierced at a gap in the plating. The remaining Tarkan spun, mandibles clicking in alarm. It barked something in its guttural language, scanning the darkness. There was no answer. Vero barely breathed, his eyes darting between the falling bodies. No gunfire, no screams, just death, swift and absolute. The Tarkan backed away, confused. Then it stopped, its body rigid. A thin line of red traced across its throat, almost delicate. A heartbeat later, its head tumbled from its shoulders. The last soldier bolted. It barely made it 3 steps before something pulled it back into the shadows. Its screams were muffled, swallowed by the darkness. And then silence again. Vero remained frozen, his pulse hammering. The Syndicate patrol was gone. But there was no movement, no sound of retreating footsteps. Just emptiness. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. Something was out there. Something human. And the Syndicate was about to learn fear. Captain Elias Vero crouched low in the ruins, his heart still pounding from what he had just witnessed. The Syndicate patrol had been wiped out without a single shot fired. No explosions, no alarms, just precise, surgical elimination. Whoever, or whatever, was out there had moved with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of brutal training. And if it was a human, it wasn't a regular soldier. This was something else. Vero wasn't sure if that made him feel relieved or afraid. He waited a full minute before moving, scanning the area for signs of the attacker. Nothing. The only evidence of what had just happened were the scattered bodies of the Syndicate troops, their lifeless forms barely disturbed by the wind. Then a sound, so faint he almost missed it. A whisper of movement. His grip tightened around his knife as he turned his head, and for the briefest of moments, he saw it. A shadow slipping through the ruins, barely visible against the darkened metal of the wreckage. It was human-shaped, but the way it moved was unnatural, flowing like smoke in the wind. And then it was gone. Vero exhaled slowly. A ghost. He knew the colony had survivors scattered across the wilderness, but none of them could do what he had just seen. No resistance fighter, no ex-Marine, No one. Keeping low, he moved through the ruins, staying in the shadows. If this thing, this phantom, was human, then he needed to find it. If it was on their side, it might be the key to taking the colony back. If not, he needed to know what they were dealing with. After an hour of careful tracking, he found his first sign. A syndicate corpse lay near the edge of the jungle, face down in the dirt. Its armor had been punctured by something sharp, too sharp for standard human weapons. The wound was clean, almost surgical. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Whoever had done this had killed with absolute certainty. Vero's mind flickered back to his past. Black Ops missions, ghost units sent behind enemy lines. He had worked with some of the best. But this was different. A second body, slumped against a tree. Another precise kill. Then footprints. Human. The tracks led deeper into the jungle, vanishing among the thick foliage. Vero hesitated for only a moment before following. Minutes passed in silence, the only sounds the distant crackle of fires from the ruined colony. Then he saw it, movement among the trees. A shape, a figure. And this time, it didn't disappear. Vero stopped, gripping his knife. The phantom was watching him. The figure stood tall, clad in dark, battle-worn armor, its edges camouflaged with jungle grime. No insignia, no markings, just a single emotionless visor reflecting the moonlight. Vero's instincts screamed at him to be careful. Whoever this was, they were no ordinary soldier. And then, in the stillness of the night, the phantom vanished once more. But not before Vero saw something that sent a chill through his spine. A name scratched into the metal of an abandoned syndicate rifle, written in human script. Core. Vero's breath caught. He knew that name. And if the stories were true, then the syndicate had just made the worst mistake of their existence. Because Dane Core was supposed to be dead. Vero knelt beside the discarded syndicate rifle, his fingers tracing the name etched into the metal. Core. The name was a ghost from his past, spoken only in hushed tones among the elite ranks of humanity's military. Dane Core. The most lethal operative to ever come out of Project Revenant, a classified program designed to create the perfect silent warrior. Ghost operatives were more than soldiers. They were living weapons, trained to infiltrate, assassinate, and vanish without a trace. But Revenant was shut down after a mission went catastrophically wrong. Core was declared KIA. Except now, here on Jericho 7, he was hunting syndicate soldiers like prey. Vero forced himself to focus. The jungle was thick, the shadows stretching long in the moonlight. If Core was watching him, which he had to be, Vero knew he wouldn't get a second chance to make contact. There was only one way to draw him out. He straightened and turned his back to the trees. "I know who you are," he said, voice low but firm. "And I know what you can do." Silence. Vero exhaled slowly. No movement, no sound. "But he's here. I know he's here. I fought in Vega Prime," he continued. "Saw what the syndicate did. And I saw what happened when Revenant got involved." He hesitated, then added, "Saw what happened to you." A shift in the air. Not a sound, but a feeling, like something unseen was pressing in. Listening. "You're killing them," Vero said, glancing toward the dead syndicate soldiers. "That's good, but one man won't be enough." He turned around slowly, scanning the tree line. "Help me build something bigger. We can take back this colony. We can." Something cold pressed against his throat. Vero froze. A blade. Razor thin, impossibly sharp. One flick of the wrist, and he'd be dead before he hit the ground. Core had moved behind him without a sound. "Hope," a voice whispered near his ear, low and cold. "Gets people killed." Then the blade was gone. Vero spun, stepping back, but Core was already retreating into the jungle. A flicker of movement, and then nothing. Vanished. Vero exhaled sharply. Fast, too fast. But now he had confirmation. Kor was alive. And more importantly, he was still at war. Vero didn't waste time. He returned to the survivors' hidden camp, deep in the canyons beyond the ruined city. They were hungry, exhausted, and barely armed. But now he had something more valuable than weapons. He had a ghost. Kor had rejected him tonight, but Vero knew men like him. You don't train to be a killer that precise without a reason to fight. Vero just had to find it. Because if he could convince Kor to stand with them, the Syndicate wouldn't just lose Jericho 7. They would learn what it meant to fear humanity. The Syndicate was afraid. Vero could see it in their movements, in the way their patrols hesitated before stepping into the jungle, their weapons raised higher than before. The fearless, methodical invaders were starting to look over their shoulders. They knew something was hunting them. But fear alone wasn't enough to win a war. Vero crouched in the survivors' hidden camp, a makeshift base built in the ruins of an old mining facility. The colonists were barely holding on, scavenging for food, hiding from Syndicate patrols, hoping for a rescue that wasn't coming. They needed weapons. They needed supplies. They needed Kor. Vero had tried tracking him again, but the man was a phantom. No trails, no signs, just whispers on the wind. The few survivors who had glimpsed him spoke of a ghost in the trees, striking Syndicate patrols, and then vanishing before they could react. But ghosts didn't win wars. Soldiers did. Vero glanced at his second-in-command, Lena Orcs, a former resistance fighter from Earth. She crossed her arms, expression grim. "He's not coming," she said. "He will," Vero said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Lena scoffed. "I don't think you get it. This guy, Kor, he's not looking for a cause. He's a damn predator. A lone wolf. He's not here to save us." Vero exhaled. Maybe she was right. But then the screams started. A sentry near the canyon entrance cried out, his voice suddenly cut short. Then another. Gunfire erupted, Syndicate weapons flashing in the darkness. Vero grabbed his rifle, sprinting toward the entrance, Lena close behind. The first thing he saw was blood. The Syndicate had sent HFY hunters. The HFY weren't soldiers. They were something worse. Biomechanical killers bred specifically to hunt and exterminate humans. Faster, stronger, immune to fear. Two of them stood at the entrance, their elongated skulls gleaming under the moonlight, clawed hands dripping with blood. Vero raised his rifle, but before he could fire, one of the HFY jerked violently, its head snapping to the side. The thin, curved blade jutted from its skull, buried to the hilt. The second HFY spun, but it was too late. A shadow dropped from above, landing in perfect silence. A flash of motion, steel slicing through flesh. The HFY collapsed, a precise, surgical strike severing its spinal cord. Silence followed. Then, out of the darkness, he stepped forward. Kor, clad in black armor stripped of insignia, his visor reflecting the fires of the battle. His blade still dripped Syndicate blood. He didn't speak. He just looked at Vero, then at the survivors behind him. Vero took a step forward. "You came." Kor tilted his head slightly. "They sent hunters." Lena frowned. And Kor's voice was cold, emotionless. "That means they're afraid." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the gathered survivors. Then, for the first time, he spoke words that sent a shiver down Vero's spine. "Let's make them suffer." The Syndicate responded the only way they knew how, overwhelming force. Within hours of the failed HFY hunter attack, Syndicate dropships darkened the skies over the jungle, their searchlights piercing through the canopy like spears of artificial daylight. They were hunting Kor. But they weren't the hunters. They were prey. Vero crouched beside Kor atop a rocky outcrop, overlooking the Syndicate convoy below. 5 armored vehicles crawled through the jungle, flanked by at least 20 heavily armed alien soldiers. Their movements were tight, disciplined, wary, a far cry from the arrogant conquerors who had razed Jericho 7 days before. They knew something was out there. They just didn't know where. Vero whispered, "That's a lot of firepower." Kor didn't respond immediately. He was still, unnaturally still, watching the enemy with the patience of a predator. When he finally spoke, it was with quiet certainty. "They're expecting an ambush." Vero frowned. "That a problem?" A hint of something dark flickered across Kor's visor. "Not for us." Then, without another word, he moved. What happened next was a lesson in silent warfare. Kor descended the rocky incline without a sound, his movements fluid, controlled. He gestured for Vero to hold back, not out of arrogance, but because Kor fought alone. That was his way. Vero watched as Kor melted into the shadows of the jungle. Gone. The convoy continued forward. Tension was thick in the air. The Syndicate soldiers scanned the tree line, gripping their weapons tight. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. The first kill was so subtle that it took Vero a second to even realize it had happened. One of the Syndicate soldiers at the rear stumbled mid-step. His body remained upright, swaying slightly, until his head tilted at an unnatural angle, blood dribbling from a precise incision at the base of his skull. He crumpled soundlessly into the undergrowth. The others didn't notice. The second kill came seconds later. A soldier near the front reached for his communicator. A shadow moved behind him, quick as a whisper. A flash of steel, a suppressed gurgle, and the alien collapsed. Still, no one noticed. Vero's breath hitched. Kor wasn't just killing them. He was dismantling them. Then, the convoy stopped. The commanding Tarkin raised a fist, sensing something was wrong. He turned his head slightly, just in time to see a Syndicate soldier standing beside him slump to the ground, a knife buried in his throat. The Tarkin barely had time to snarl before a figure dropped from the trees above him. Kor landed with inhuman grace, spinning low and driving his blade into the Tarkin's exposed side. The alien choked on its own blood before Kor twisted the blade upward, puncturing its secondary heart. Panic erupted. Gunfire flashed. Orders were shouted. But it was too late. By the time the first soldier raised his weapon, Kor was already gone, vanished into the jungle. And now, the Syndicate truly knew fear. Panic spread through the Syndicate ranks like wildfire. Soldiers barked orders in their guttural tongue, forming a defensive circle around their remaining vehicles. The jungle around them had become a death trap, each shadow a potential grave. They had come to hunt a ghost. Instead, the ghost was hunting them. Captain Vero watched from his vantage point, gripping his rifle. The convoy was already crippled, half their forces dead, their morale shattered. But the real fight was about to begin. Because the warlord had arrived. A thunderous roar echoed through the jungle as a massive figure dropped from a hovering gunship, landing with a ground-shaking impact. Kassar Drek, a Tarkin warlord, stood over 8 feet tall, his crimson armor reinforced with heavy plating, his 4 glowing eyes scanning the battlefield. Unlike his subordinates, he didn't fear the dark. He had been bred to conquer it. Kor emerged from the shadows, moving with his usual deadly precision. But Drek didn't flinch. The warlord extended a massive arm, activating an energy shield that crackled to life around him. His other hand gripped a shock maul, a brutal, electrified weapon designed to pulverize human bones with a single strike. Kor didn't hesitate. He struck first, closing the distance with impossible speed. His blade flashed, aiming for the warlord's throat, but the shield flared, deflecting the strike with a surge of energy. Drek countered instantly, swinging his shock maul in a devastating arc. Kor twisted away just in time, the weapon missing his head by inches and slamming into the ground, sending a shockwave through the jungle floor. Kor landed lightly, recalculating. Adapt, find the weakness, exploit. The shield was a problem. The maul was worse. Drek lunged, faster than something his size had any right to be. Kor barely avoided the next strike, But the warlord anticipated the dodge, twisting his body and bringing an armored fist around in a brutal backhand. Kor took the hit. It was like being hit by a freight train. The impact sent him crashing through a tree, his body slamming into the dirt. Pain flared through his ribs. Vero watched in shock. Kor never got hit, and yet he was still alive. Drek stalked toward him, confidence radiating from his massive frame. "You fight well, human," the warlord growled. His voice was deep, gravelly, like the sound of tectonic plates shifting. "But you are still prey." Kor forced himself to his feet, exhaling slowly. Blood dripped from his lip, but his stance remained perfectly balanced. He tilted his head slightly. "That's so." Drek sneered. "You cannot kill me." Kor's visor gleamed under the moonlight. "I don't need to." He reached to his belt. A detonator. Drek's eyes widened as he finally noticed the explosives Kor had planted on his armor during their exchange. A beat of silence. Then, Kor pressed the trigger. The jungle exploded in fire. The jungle erupted in a wave of fire and shrapnel. The explosive charges Kor had planted on Drek's armor detonated in perfect sequence, sending a concussive blast through the trees. Syndicate soldiers were thrown off their feet, their shrieks lost in the roar of the explosion. Vero shielded his eyes as the fireball swallowed the warlord. No one, nothing, could survive that. And yet, from within the flames, a hulking figure emerged. Kossar Drek was still alive. His armor was scorched, parts of it blasted away to reveal the thick, sinewy muscle beneath. His energy shield had failed, but his rage remained. Smoke curled from his burned skin. His breathing was heavy, labored, but he was still standing. He locked eyes with Kor. "You dare." Kor didn't answer. He was already moving. With his shield down, Drek was vulnerable. Kor closed the distance in a blur. His blade flashed, slicing toward the Tarkin's throat. But Drek intercepted the strike with his bare hand. Metal met flesh, and for a moment, it looked as though the warlord had stopped him. Then, Kor twisted the blade. The razor-sharp edge bit deep into Drek's palm, slicing through tendons. The warlord roared in pain, his massive frame shuddering. That was the opening Kor needed. A second blade appeared in Kor's other hand. Smaller, faster. He drove it into the warlord's side, just beneath the ribs. Precision strike. Drek staggered, his four glowing eyes widening in shock. He tried to swing his shock maul, but his grip faltered. The weapon fell from his grasp, crashing into the dirt. Kor didn't stop. He ripped his first blade free and drove it into Drek's throat. Silence. The massive warlord stood frozen, his body trembling. His breath hitched, then gurgled. Kor twisted the blade one final time. Drek collapsed. For a brief moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then the remaining syndicate soldiers broke. Their warlord was dead. Their command structure shattered. Fear overtook them. Some ran into the jungle, hoping to escape. Others dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in surrender. Vero stepped forward, rifle at the ready, but it was already over. Kor stood over Drek's body, silent as death itself. Slowly, he pulled his blade free, wiping the blood against his armor. Lena Oris approached cautiously. That was brutal. Vero shook his head. That was war. Kor turned toward them, his expression unreadable beneath his visor. The Syndicate will send more. Vero nodded. Then we keep killing them. For the first time, Kor didn't vanish back into the jungle. He simply looked at Vero and said, "Then we make them fear the dark." The jungle was silent once more. The Syndicate soldiers who had survived fled into the darkness, leaving behind the wreckage of their convoy and the smoldering remains of their fallen warlord. The resistance fighters emerged from their hiding places, staring in shock at the carnage Kor had unleashed. Vero stepped forward, surveying the scene. The tide had turned. For the first time since the fall of Jericho 7, They had dealt the Syndicate a crippling blow. But the war wasn't over. Kor stood over the body of Khosr Drek, motionless. The flames cast eerie shadows across his battle-worn armor. His blades, still slick with Syndicate blood, gleamed in the flickering light. Vero exhaled, gripping his rifle. It was time. "We need you," he said. Kor didn't move. Vero took a step closer. "You didn't have to come back. You could have stayed in the jungle, hunting them one by one. But you didn't." His voice was steady. "You fought with us." Kor tilted his head slightly, his visor reflecting the flames. "The Syndicate won't stop." "I know," Vero said, "which is why we need more than just a ghost. We need a force, a real resistance." Lena stepped up beside him. "We have people," she said. "Survivors, fighters. But they don't have your skills. They don't know how to win." Kor remained silent. Vero pressed forward. "You could leave right now. Keep fighting alone. Kill a few more patrols. But you know as well as I do, that won't stop them." His eyes locked onto Kor's visor. "You want to make them suffer." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Kor moved. He knelt beside the dead warlord and reached for something inside the ruined armor. A small circular device. A command relay. Kor studied it for a moment before tossing it to Vero. "This," Kor said, voice low, "will tell you where they're regrouping." Vero caught it, glancing down at the Syndicate script glowing on the surface. A rendezvous point. The remnants of the invasion force were gathering at an old supply depot, a heavily fortified structure in the eastern ruins. Kor turned to face the gathered survivors. His voice, usually little more than a whisper, carried sharp and clear. "If you want a war," he said, "then we start with this." A murmur spread through the crowd. Fear, uncertainty. But then Lena spoke. "Then let's end this." The resistance had a target. And with dying Kor leading them, the Syndicate was about to learn what it meant to fear humanity. The resistance moved under cover of night. Guided by Kor's intel, they navigated the ruins toward the Syndicate's supply depot, an old industrial complex reinforced with heavy weapons, automated turrets, and 2 full platoons of alien soldiers. It was their stronghold, their fallback point. And soon, it would be their grave. Vero crouched on a ridge overlooking the depot, studying the patrol patterns below. Syndicate forces were on edge, their movements tight and cautious. Word of the warlord's death had spread. They were afraid. Good. Lena lay beside him, her rifle trained on the nearest sentry tower. "This is insane," she muttered. "We're attacking a fortified base with a bunch of half-starved colonists and scavenged weapons." Vero smirked. "Yeah." She exhaled sharply. "At least we've got a demon on our side." Vero followed her gaze. Kor was already inside the depot. Like a shadow slipping through the dark, he had infiltrated the perimeter without a sound. The Syndicate never even knew he was there. Vero tapped his comm. "Kor, we're in position." Silence. Then his voice, cold, controlled. "Wait for my signal." A single sentry on the catwalk jerked suddenly, his body going stiff. A thin blade had slipped between the plates of his armor, puncturing his secondary heart. Before his partner even turned, Kor was already gone. Vero gripped his rifle. That's the signal. Chaos erupted. The resistance opened fire. Sniper rounds punched through alien skulls. Explosives tore through barricades. Syndicate soldiers scrambled for cover, roaring orders, but the ghosts were already inside. And then, Kor struck. He moved through the depot like a specter of death, his blades flashing through flesh and armor with terrifying precision. A Syndicate gunner pivoted, too slow. Kor's knife slid under his chin, severing his throat. A Tarkin commander raised his pulse rifle. Kor was already behind him. A blade slammed into his spine, and the alien collapsed without a sound. The Syndicate tried to regroup, but they were fighting shadows. Panic spread. The resistance pressed forward. Vero leaped over a barricade, laying down suppressing fire as Lena tossed a grenade into the enemy ranks. The explosion rocked the depot, sending alien bodies flying. The Syndicate line collapsed. And then the last survivors ran. Kor didn't chase them. He stood in the wreckage of their stronghold, watching them flee into the night. He wanted them to run. Because when the Syndicate called for reinforcements, they wouldn't say they were fighting an army. They would say they were fighting something else, something they couldn't stop. Vero stepped beside Kor, breathing heavily. We won. Kor didn't look at him. His voice was quiet. Final. No. He turned his head, watching the distant glow of Syndicate ships in the sky. Not yet. The final battle was coming. The Syndicate came at dawn. Their dropships blotted out the sky, sleek black vessels descending like predatory birds. The last remnants of their invasion force. Heavy troopers, war machines, and an overseer, the highest-ranking officer in the sector, had come to crush the rebellion once and for all. But Vero wasn't afraid, because this time they were ready. The depot's ruins had become a fortress, reinforced with Syndicate weapons, scavenged armor, and deadly traps set by Kor himself. The resistance fighters, once refugees, now warriors, stood waiting in the shadows, fingers on triggers, hearts steady. Vero checked his rifle one last time. Beside him, Lena cracked her knuckles. You ever take on an overseer before? Vero exhaled. First time for everything. A low voice cut through their comms. Kor. They're moving. Vero glanced at the ridge where Kor had positioned himself. He couldn't see him. But that was the point. The enemy was about to step into his world. The Syndicate advanced. Armored shock troopers stormed the depot ruins, their energy shields absorbing the first wave of sniper fire. Combat walkers stomped forward, their rotary cannons spinning up. Then the first trap went off. A detonator buried under the rubble exploded, collapsing the key entry point. Fire and debris rained down, cutting off the Syndicate's retreat. Then the real attack began. From the shadows, the ghosts struck. Resistance snipers pinned down the Syndicate's heavy units while ground teams flanked their exposed forces. Explosives ripped apart walkers, and pulse rifles tore through alien ranks. And in the chaos, Kor moved. The first Syndicate captain never saw him. One moment, he was barking orders. The next, his throat was slit. The second tried to raise his rifle. Kor's blade took his arm first. He moved through their ranks like a phantom, striking where they least expected. His enemies never screamed, never had the chance. Only brief flashes of steel, a soft gurgle, and then silence. The Overseer watched from his command pod, towering over the battlefield. His deep voice rumbled across the comms. Enough. Burn them all. The Syndicate's final weapon activated. A stratospheric bombardment beacon flared to life, calling for orbital fire. Vero's heart clenched. They're wiping the whole site. Lena cursed. We can't stop that. But Kor could. He broke from the shadows, sprinting toward the beacon. A hail of gunfire rained down, Syndicate officers scrambling to stop him. But he was too fast. A throwing blade took out a gunner. Another slammed into the beacon's power relay. Sparks erupted. Kor reached the console and ripped the control core free. The beacon died. The Overseer turned, just in time to see Kor standing behind him. The last thing the alien ever felt was a knife slipping into his second heart. Then, silence. The Syndicate was broken. Their ships retreated. Jericho 7 was free. Vero stood over the battlefield, watching the enemy flee. The survivors cheered, wept, embraced. But Kor was already walking away, stepping back into the shadows. Vero called after him. You don't have to leave. Kor paused. For the first time, there was a flicker of something human in his voice. I never stay. Then, like a ghost in the night, he vanished, and the legend of the Silent Warrior began.